There's a kind of exhaustion that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. You didn't run a marathon, you didn't pull an all-nighter, you didn't have a particularly dramatic day, you just existed, managed things, kept track of things, made sure nothing fell through the cracks, and by evening you feel like you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time. The frustrating part is that when you try to point to what exactly exhausted you, there's nothing obvious there. No single task that was too hard, no crisis that drained you, just the accumulation of 100 small things that never quite leave your head. Psychologists and neuroscientists have spent the last 2 decades trying to understand what's actually happening in that experience. What they've found is not a character flaw, not a productivity problem, and not something that more sleep will fix. It's a specific cognitive phenomenon, one that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, consumes real neurological resources, and accumulates silently throughout the day without ever appearing on any to-do list. Researchers call it mental load, and understanding what it actually is, mechanistically, changes the way you think about why you're tired, what mental load is, and what it isn't. Mental load is not stress, it's not anxiety, it's not the feeling of having too much to do. It is the cognitive work of tracking, anticipating, and managing, the background processing required to hold an ongoing model of everything that needs to happen, might need to happen, or could go wrong if someone doesn't keep track of it. It is the part of your mind that is simultaneously aware that the dentist appointment needs to be rescheduled, that a colleague's tone in yesterday's email was off and might need to be addressed, that the presentation next Thursday requires 3 things you haven't started yet, that you're almost out of something you need, and that you said you'd follow up on something 2 days ago and haven't. None of these things are being actively thought about. They are being held, maintained in a kind of cognitive suspension, monitored in the background, ready to surface when triggered. This is the distinction that matters. Mental load is not the work of doing. It is the work of tracking everything that needs to be done, by whom, by when, and what happens if it isn't. And that work never stops. The neuroscience, what the brain is actually doing. To understand why mental load is exhausting, you need to understand what it costs the brain to maintain it. Working memory, the system that holds information actively in mind, has a well-documented capacity limit. Cognitive psychologist George Miller identified in 1956 that the brain can hold approximately 7 items, plus or minus 2, in active working memory at any given time. Later research has revised that number down, with more recent estimates suggesting the functional limit is closer to 4 distinct items or chunks. Mental load doesn't respect this limit. It operates by distributing its contents across multiple systems: working memory, long-term memory, the brain's prospective memory system that tracks future obligations, and the default mode network that continues processing unresolved items during background activity. What this means in practice is that the cognitive architecture required to maintain mental load is not localized to one system. It is distributed across the brain, consuming resources from multiple networks simultaneously, none of which can fully release because the tracking task is never complete. Neuroscientist Étienne Couchelin at the École Normale Supérieure has studied the prefrontal cortex's role in managing multiple concurrent goals. His research found that the prefrontal cortex can effectively manage 2 simultaneous task goals, but performance degrades significantly when a third is added. The system begins making trade-offs, things get dropped. Mental load, by its nature, involves far more than three concurrent goals. The prefrontal cortex is managing an inventory that expands and contracts throughout the day, never reaches zero, and cannot be fully offloaded. The exhaustion this produces is not metaphorical. It is the measurable depletion of a cognitive system that has been running at or near capacity for hours, not on any single demanding task, but on the continuous low-level work of keeping track of everything. Why it's invisible, and why that makes it worse. The specific cruelty of mental load as a source of exhaustion is that it produces no visible output. When you spend a day writing, you have something written. When you spend a day in meetings, you have decisions made. When you spend a day managing logistics, things get managed. But the cognitive work of tracking, of maintaining the model, anticipating the problems, holding the threads, produces nothing that can be pointed to at the end of the day. This invisibility has two consequences. The first is that the person experiencing mental load often cannot fully account for their own exhaustion. The day didn't look that hard from the outside. It didn't feel that hard in any single moment. The depletion accumulated gradually, below conscious awareness, and surfaces as a fatigue that seems disproportionate to what actually happened. The second is that the people around them often can't see it either. Mental load is, almost by definition, the work that happens in someone's head rather than in observable action. It is effort without artifact, cognitive labor without a product. And because it leaves no trace, it tends to go unacknowledged, sometimes even by the person carrying it. Researcher Alison Daminger at Harvard studied the cognitive dimensions of household management and found that mental load involves four distinct phases: anticipating needs, identifying options, making decisions, and monitoring outcomes. Of these four, only the third, making decisions, tends to be visible to others. The anticipation, the identification, and the ongoing monitoring happen invisibly, and they happen continuously. What looks from the outside like someone simply being organized is, from the inside, a full-time background process consuming real cognitive resources around the clock. The accumulation problem: mental load is not static. It accumulates. Each unresolved item added to the tracking system is a small additional draw on cognitive resources. Each obligation that can't be completed, and therefore must continue to be held, is another thread the prefrontal cortex has to maintain. Each potential problem that needs to be monitored is another background process running. Individually, each of these is negligible. Collectively, over the course of a day, or a week, or a month, the accumulation produces what researchers describe as cognitive overload, a state in which the demands on the system consistently exceed its available resources. What makes this particularly difficult to address is that mental load doesn't behave like a to-do list. Completing items doesn't necessarily reduce the load, because the act of completion often generates new items to track. Finishing one thing surfaces three more. The list doesn't get shorter. It evolves. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on cognitive depletion, the idea that self-regulatory and cognitive resources are consumed by use and require recovery, provides a framework for understanding what chronic mental load does over time. Even if the depletion recovery model is more nuanced than early research suggested, the core finding holds. Cognitive systems that are consistently taxed without adequate recovery time show measurable degradation in performance and well-being. Mental load is not an acute stressor, it is a chronic one, and chronic cognitive taxation without adequate periods of genuine release produces a kind of exhaustion that sleep addresses only partially. because the tracking system doesn't fully disengage during rest the way task-focused systems do. What the research on mental load reveals is not that some people are bad at managing their cognitive resources, or that the solution is better organization or more efficient systems. It reveals that there is a category of cognitive work that is structurally invisible, structurally unending, and structurally exhausting, and that the people doing it often have no framework for understanding why they're tired, because the work doesn't look like work from any angle they can see. There's something worth sitting with in what this research describes. The exhaustion you feel at the end of a day when nothing obviously hard happened is not disproportionate. It is not a sign that something is wrong with your capacity or your resilience. It is the accurate reflection of a cognitive system that has been working continuously, tracking, anticipating, monitoring, holding, in a mode that produces no visible output and receives no visible acknowledgement. The brain doesn't distinguish between the work that shows and the work that doesn't. It pays the same cost either way. What the research can't tell you is how to put the weight down. What it can tell you is that the weight is real, and that it was always there, even when no one could see it. Mind Translator, Psychology translated clearly.